Welcome to the Mike Bates Show. This is Mike Bates. What is the status of the 2020 presidential election? Well, both sides seem to think there is an attempt to steal the election. The difference is in which side each side thinks is trying to steal the election. As for me, I'm stating right up front that I don't know who won the election. What I am stating is that we need to let the process play out and discover the truth. And the fake news needs to quit censoring the Trump campaign's claims and delegitimizing what Trump's attorneys are doing. 3 of Donald Trump's most prominent attorneys are publicly stating that they have absolute proof the election was stolen. Listen to what Rudy Giuliani said Thursday afternoon at a press conference in Washington that the so-called news media largely ignored.
We cannot let this happen to us. We cannot allow these crooks, because that's what they are, to steal an election from the American people. They elected Donald Trump. They didn't elect Joe Biden. Joe Biden is in the lead because of the fraudulent ballots, the illegal ballots that were produced and that were allowed to be used after the election was over. Give us an opportunity to prove it in court, and we will.
Listen to what Sidney Powell told Maria Bartiromo.
We're fixing to overturn the results of the election in multiple states, and President Trump won by not just hundreds of thousands of votes, but by millions of votes that were shifted by this software that was designed expressly for that purpose. We have sworn witness testimony of why the software was designed. It was designed to rig elections. He was fully briefed on it. He saw it happen in other countries. It was exported internationally for profit by the people that are behind Smartmatic and Dominion. They did this on purpose. It was calculated. They've done it before. We have evidence from 2016 in California. We have so much evidence, I feel like it's coming in through a fire hose.
Wow. So, Sidney, you feel that you will be able to prove this. Do you have the software in your possession? Do you have the hardware in your possession? How will you prove this, Sidney?
Well, I've got lots of ways to prove it, Maria, but I'm not going to tell on national TV what all we have. I just can't do that.
Okay, but you have a small time frame here. The elections are supposed to be certified in early December. Do you believe that you can present this to the courts and be successful within this just couple of weeks?
Well, let me put it this way. First of all, I never say anything I can't prove. Secondly, the evidence is coming in so fast, I can't even process it all.
And finally, here's what Lynn Wood told Mark Levin.
Donald Trump won by such a large margin that in the middle of the night they had to stop counting, and you'll see in key states they started bringing in ballots by the truckload. All of them for Biden, many of them in these mail-in ballots with little bubbles for you to circle the person you selected, all of them for Biden with perfect circles. I believe upon examination you're going to find those perfect circles were made by a computer. This election was stolen, but they got caught.
Is it possible those claims have merit? Yes. Is it possible those claims are complete nonsense, but are genuinely believed by the attorneys themselves because they're so heavily supportive of the president? Also, yes. But since we don't know, it is irresponsible to call these claims baseless as the media is doing. And it is irresponsible to call Joe Biden the president-elect as if that's an absolute certainty, as the media is doing. So because the propaganda press isn't telling you the whole truth, I'm going to tell you on today's show. It will be as much of the whole truth as I can fit into 1 hour. Except when election problems have been proven, and I will tell you which ones have been, I make no claims as to the veracity of the claims the Trump campaign is alleging. I'm simply informing you on this program that the claims exist and that the outcome of this election has not yet been determined. Now, some of the allegations, especially the ones about the software and the vote tabulation computers being manipulated to deliberately alter the vote count, are difficult for me to believe. I find it highly unlikely. But that doesn't mean it's impossible for it to have occurred. But the so-called news media is treating it as if it is literally impossible. They're treating it as if it's the equivalent of time-traveling space aliens from the future having done it. And by treating it that way, they are censoring the legitimate story. Now, I'm not saying what is alleged to have happened actually happened. I'm saying that if the campaign of the President of the United States says something happens, that in and of itself is newsworthy and should be covered. Even if it's complete nonsense, the fact that it is being alleged by the President's people makes it newsworthy. But by either ignoring it, as most media is doing, or refuting it based on nothing but a belief that it can't be true, the media is irresponsibly keeping the American people ignorant and uninformed. And that is very dangerous. Because if any of the allegations turn out to be true, most people in this country would be blindsided by it. And that will trigger a reaction that will be very violent. If the margin of victory was such that Donald Trump had been declared the winner on election night, the violent leftist thugs of Black Lives Matter and Antifa would have rioted in cities all across America. Heck, he didn't win on election night, and they still rioted in Portland, Chicago, and New York. But what do you think their reaction would be if the courts, and ultimately, obviously, the Supreme Court, determined that the election was so rigged and illegally conducted that they threw out the results in enough states that Donald Trump does get reelected? They'd riot if a recount results in a Trump win also, but I don't see any chance that a recount alone will move enough votes. But if President Trump's attorneys are able to convince the courts that the election was so improperly conducted, and in at the very least, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and New Jersey, it absolutely was, although New Jersey wouldn't go to Trump under any scenario. But if the election results are tossed in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Georgia, or Arizona, all those states have Republican legislatures who could on their own assign their electoral college votes to Trump. And to win the electoral college majority, Trump would need any 3 of those 5. Or he could win with just 2 if the 2 come from Pennsylvania, Michigan, or Georgia. So this race is not the fait accompli the media is telling you it is. Because there was so much process malfeasance in Michigan and Pennsylvania that the results of those 2 states should absolutely be thrown out by the courts. Will they be? I doubt it. Should they be? Absolutely. Both states committed such massive violations of the Equal Protection Clause of our Constitution that their entire elections should be tossed. Remember, it was the Equal Protection Clause that caused the 7-2 decision of the U.S. Supreme Court in Bush v. Gore that stopped the illegal recount Al Gore and the Democrats were pursuing, and for a while getting. Now, understand, if you're a Trump supporter, I don't want you to get your hopes up. I think it's a long shot that the courts will throw out the election results in those states. But if they do, Trump would win under the only 2 possible scenarios that would follow. The first being the state legislatures pick Trump electors. And the second being the state doesn't pick any electors, and the decision falls into the hands of the U.S. Congress, where the House would pick the president and the Senate would pick the vice president. In either of those, assuming votes are along party lines, Trump, Pence win. And I do need to change one thing I said last week about how the House would vote. I said last week that the House would pick Trump because the Republicans had majorities in the delegations of 26 states. Well, that was based on the projection at the time. Since then, the race in Iowa's 2nd congressional district has been finalized, and Republican Miller Meeks won, which means Republicans will actually have majorities in 27 state delegations to the U.S. House, not 26. And that's assuming Miller Meeks' victory holds after the recount is finalized. In the initial count, she won by just 47 votes, which is a margin of 0.01193%. If we round that, the margin was 12 thousandths of a percent. But even without Iowa, Republicans have a majority in the delegations of a majority of states, and that would give Donald Trump the victory if Congress ends up deciding the 2020 presidential election. And that's why it's so irresponsible of the media to do what they're doing. They're acting as if a Trump win is impossible. And it isn't. Yeah, it's unlikely, but it's not impossible. If just 3 states, or 2 states, depending on which they are, that have been called by the media for Biden change from Biden to Trump, Trump wins. Don't you think that's close enough of a margin that the press should be covering this story accurately instead of how they are? But Mike, the government said that this was the most secure election in American history. Yeah, that's what they said. I'll tell you what that really means when the Mike Bates Show continues. Welcome back to the Mike Bates Show. This is Mike Bates. So the Trump campaign is alleging widespread fraud in the presidential election. But Mike, I saw on the news that the director of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency said the election was the most secure in American history. That's a government agency, so Trump must be lying. Uh-huh. Yeah, that statement was made by Chris Krebs, who was the head of that agency. On November 12th, just 9 days after the election, he issued a statement that, quote, "The November 3rd election was the most secure in American history. There is no evidence that any voting system deleted or lost votes, changed votes, or was in any way compromised," end quote. And the anti-Trump media ran with that claim as if it was the indisputable truth because it helped portray Trump's claims as baseless. But was it true? No, it wasn't. First of all, that statement only addressed computer intrusion by outside actors, not deliberate fraud and malfeasance by humans. Second, how would we know in less than 10 days? We wouldn't. Cybersecurity breaches can take years to discover and are sometimes never discovered. Third, we know with absolute certainty that there were at least 3 errors, or would have been described as errors, in Michigan that did change the vote count. We know it because after Republicans complained, election officials went back and found, you can't see my fingers making air quotes, but I'm making them, election officials found the errors and corrected them. So even if you want to believe that Chris Krebs thought his agency's statement was accurate, it definitely wasn't. President Trump fired Krebs on Tuesday. And of course, the Democrats and the media, but I repeat myself, denounced that termination as Trump being vindictive and petty and dishonest, and took the opportunity to repeat their false claims that the election was perfect and that Trump is just a crybaby throwing a temper tantrum because the election didn't go his way. And the dishonest media is also reporting that international observers have signed off on our election as having been properly conducted, even though that's not true. Oh, it's true that observers from the Organization of American States said that our election was properly conducted, but those OAS observers observed a few counties in 4 states: Georgia, Iowa, Maryland, and Michigan, plus the District of Columbia. Well, D.C. and Maryland are so dark blue that the Democrats do not need fraud to win. The other 3 states had such a minuscule percentage of their elections observed as to be meaningless. We have 3,141 counties in America. These observers were in less than 3 dozen. Ergo, they have no idea what happened in 99.988% of the counties. And they observed less than 10% of what happened in the counties they did observe. In other words, their report is meaningless. But the activist press is reporting their opinions as if it's the nectar of the gods, and anything that disputes it is conspiracy theory by the Trump-tards. Now, even if you think Trump is horrible and his claims have no merit, wouldn't you want them to be thoroughly investigated and disproven? The fact that the Democrats and the media are so adamantly opposed to even looking into any allegations of fraud and malfeasance makes me wonder why. What are they afraid an investigation will find? If there's no wrongdoing, wouldn't you want that proven? Wouldn't you want the victory to be so certain that no one could ever call your guy's victory illegitimate or stolen? Wouldn't you want your guy's victory confirmed by proving in court that your opponent's claims have no merit? I would. If I was Biden and I had nothing to hide, I'd welcome an investigation that proved beyond any doubt that I legitimately won the election. But no, Democrats don't want any investigation at all. What are they afraid an investigation would reveal? Let's take a break, and when we come back, I will tell you what some of those specific allegations of wrongdoing are. When the Mike Bates Show continues.